There is a concept in structural engineering known as the silent load. It refers to the weight a building carries that wasn't designed into the blueprints, the weight of the earth pressing in, the vibration of the tectonic plates, and the psychological pressure of the people inside. Most of us live in spaces designed for light and air. We build upwards, toward the sun, as if it's a biological necessity. But there is a secondary architecture, a shadow network of windowless facilities buried beneath the American heartland. These are structures that were never meant to be seen, yet they are very much alive. In the early 1970s, at the height of the Cold War, a series of radical architectural experiments began across the Midwest. They were officially called Earthships. These weren't the hippie-style, sustainable homes you might see in New Mexico today. These were brutalist subterranean fortresses. They were built from high-density, steel-reinforced concrete, designed to survive a direct nuclear strike and remain self-sufficient for decades. On paper, they were the ultimate survivalist dream. By 1985, however, the government funding for these projects supposedly evaporated. The entrances were welded shut, the air intake pipes were cut to the ground, and the sites were buried under 3 feet of topsoil. But the paper trail tells a different story. If you spend enough time in the public archives of Vinton County, Ohio, a place where the woods are dense and the cell signal is non-existent, you will find a set of land tax records that shouldn't exist. 14 of these original Earthship structures remain listed as active residential. They aren't owned by families, and they aren't owned by the Department of Defense. They are held by a rotating series of private shell companies. The names change every 5 years, but the primary holding is always listed as Passive Observation Holdings. These trusts don't use electronic bank transfers. Every January, a courier arrives at the county clerk's office in a vehicle with no license plates. They pay the property taxes in cash, crisp, sequential bills, and leave without signing the visitor log. For the people who live in the small towns bordering these forests, the structures are a source of quiet dread. Local hunters have reported a phenomenon they call the dead air. It's a specific radius, roughly 500 yards around the buried concrete slabs, where the natural world simply stops. Birds don't nest in the trees above these sites. Insects don't chirp. Even the wind seems to lose its force. One local tracker, who spent 30 years in these woods, described it as a manufactured silence. He claimed that if you stand perfectly still on the center of the concrete slab at midnight, you can feel a vibration coming through the soles of your boots, a low, rhythmic thrumming that matches the frequency of a human heart at rest. The electric company's records are perhaps the most damning evidence. Despite being abandoned and sealed, the meters for these 14 properties show a massive, constant draw from the local power grid. It's a load consistent with heavy-duty industrial ventilation and server cooling. Someone is keeping the lights on in the dark. Someone is keeping the air moving in rooms that haven't seen a human being in 40 years. We are left with a series of uncomfortable questions. If these bunkers are sealed, who is maintaining the power? If they are empty, why is the air being filtered? And most importantly, what happens to the human mind when it is removed from the cycle of day and night and placed inside a machine designed only to observe? Today, we are going deep into the declassified files of Passive Observation Holdings. We are going to explore the terrifying reality of containment architecture, the science of why windowless rooms can cause the brain to eat itself, and the first-hand accounts of those who were hired to watch the things that live in the silence. You are watching silent anomalies. Do not trust the geometry of the room you are sitting in. To understand the true intent behind these structures, we have to look back at the winter of 1962. In the small town of Artesia, New Mexico, the United States government authorized a project that remains one of the most controversial experiments in architectural history. They built the Abo Elementary School. On the surface, it looked like a standard concrete basketball court, a flat, unremarkable slab. But beneath that slab, behind a 3-ton steel blast door, was a windowless world. For 8 years, several hundred children attended school 40 feet underground. The official narrative was simple: civil defense. Artesia was located near a major Air Force base, and the school was a pilot program for survivalist education. But as the years went by, the declassified psychological logs from the staff revealed a much darker reality. The project wasn't just about surviving a bomb. It was a study in containment psychology. The teachers reported that within months, the students' perception of the world began to warp. Without a horizon line, the children began to lose their sense of spatial awareness. They grew aggressive in the hallways, yet catatonic in the classrooms. But the most disturbing entry in the 1966 staff report involves the windows. Several teachers noted that students had begun using their fingernails and pencils to scratch frames into the solid concrete walls of the cafeteria. When asked what they were doing, the children claimed they were looking at the other playground. They described a place where the sun was a pale, flickering light, and the trees grew upside down from a grey sky. Architecture is more than just the arrangement of wood and stone. It is the primary regulator of the human ego. Our brains are biologically hardwired to calibrate themselves against the movement of the sun and the presence of a horizon. This is our environmental anchor. When you remove that anchor, when you place a human being in a perfectly climate-controlled, windowless box, the brain begins to auto-complete the missing data. Within 72 hours, the circadian rhythm doesn't just drift, it collapses. This is the onset of temporal displacement. You don't just lose track of the hour, you lose the ability to distinguish between a memory, a dream, and the present moment. The trusts behind passive observation holdings didn't just study these effects, they weaponized them through acoustic geometry. In a standard room, sound waves hit a wall and dissipate. But in a subterranean concrete cylinder, sound behaves with predatory precision. Through a phenomenon called whispering galleries, a person standing on one side of a circular room can hear the breathing of someone on the exact opposite side, as if they were standing an inch away. But it's the sound you can't hear that does the most damage. Infrasound, frequencies vibrating at 19 Hz, just below the threshold of human hearing. In 1998, researcher Vic Tandy discovered that 19 Hz is the resonant frequency of the human eyeball. When exposed to this vibration, your vision smears, creating grey, fleeting shapes in your peripheral vision. It triggers an ancient, vestigial panic response. Your heart rate climbs. Your skin chills. You feel a profound sense of being watched by something just out of sight. Passive observation facilities were designed with these specific dimensions in mind. They weren't built to be comfortable. They were built to be resonant chambers. The very walls were tuned to keep the occupant in a state of hypervigilance, a permanent fight or flight response with no visible enemy to fight and nowhere to fly. The question we must ask is, why? Why spend millions of dollars to build a psychological trap beneath the dirt of Ohio? The answer lies in the observer effect. In quantum physics, the mere act of observing a particle changes its behavior. The trusts weren't just building bunkers, they were building laboratories to see what happens when the human mind is forced to observe the silent load for too long. And as we are about to see, in the case of a man named Elias, sometimes the building starts to observe you back. In the late autumn of 2022, a mechanical engineer whom we will call Elias was approached in a hotel lobby in Cincinnati. He had been out of work for 6 months. The man who met him didn't provide a name, only a briefcase containing a non-disclosure agreement and a contract for environmental maintenance. The terms were simple: 7 days of residency in a subterranean facility. No heavy labor. Just the monitoring of air pressure gauges and the logging of structural integrity. The payment was $30,000, half of which was paid up front in cash. Elias was driven to a remote coordinate in the Ohio River Valley. He was stripped of his phone, his watch, and any link to the outside world. The man in the van gave him 3 rules, delivered with the flat tone of someone reciting a grocery list. Rule 1. Never bring a timepiece. The facility provides its own rhythm. Rule 2. Never count the doors in the central corridor. Rule 3. If the ventilation hum stops, hold your breath until it resumes. The elevator ride lasted nearly 2 minutes. When the doors opened, Elias found himself in a brutalist tomb. The walls were unpainted concrete, still bearing the grain of the wooden molds they were poured into 40 years prior. The air was cold and smelled faintly of ozone and old wet stone. The first 48 hours were uneventful. Elias followed his checklist. He moved from the living quarters to the machine room, recording the hum of the turbines. But by the 3rd day, the acoustic shadows we discussed in Act 2 began to manifest. Elias reported in his subsequent journals that the silence of the bunker wasn't empty. It was heavy. He began to hear the sound of a sink running in the kitchen while he was in the bedroom. When he investigated, the taps were dry, the basin dusty. He began to feel the observer effect. He felt as though the building was tracking his movements. If he sat in the common area, the ventilation would surge, blowing a cold, aggressive draft onto the back of his neck. If he moved to the corner of the room, the lights in that specific corner would flicker and dim, as if struggling to register his presence. On day 4, the isolation triggered the temporal collapse. Elias, having no watch, began to count his own heartbeats to measure time. This focus on his internal rhythm made him hyper-aware of the external geometry. Despite the warnings, he counted the doors. 1, 2, 10, 21. The corridor was a perfect circle. 21 doors. But on his next rotation, there were 22. He stopped. He backed up. He counted again. 21. He laughed it off as a micro-dream, the brain auto-completing data in the dark. But the seed was sown. On day 5, Rule 3 was tested. The ventilation hum, the constant comforting white noise of the bunker, simply stopped. The silence that followed was physical. It pressed against his eardrums like deep-sea water. Elias sat on his cot, lungs burning, holding his breath as instructed. The silence lasted for what felt like 10 minutes, and then the scratching started. It was the distinct sound of a graphite pencil moving across heavy paper. It was coming from the other side of the concrete wall, a wall that, according to the blueprints, was backed by 6 feet of solid earth. Then, a voice. It wasn't a monster's growl or a ghostly moan. It was a recording of Elias's own voice, captured from a voice memo he had made just hours earlier. The voice whispered, "Door 22 is open now." Elias didn't wait for the hum to resume. He grabbed his flashlight and sprinted for the elevator. As he passed the central corridor, his light swept over the wall. There, between doors 14 and 15, was a new opening. It wasn't steel. It was a dark, porous material that looked like organic tissue. It was vibrating. He didn't look inside. He hit the emergency stairs and climbed until his fingernails bled, eventually bursting through a hidden hatch in the forest floor, miles from the entry point. 6 months later, a similar report emerged from a dark data center in Northern Virginia. A security guard named Sarah was monitoring a facility owned by the same shell corporation. This facility was modern, fiber optics, LED lighting, and high-end security cameras. Sarah's anomaly began on the monitors. On her third night, she noticed that the server racks in storage wing D were slightly out of alignment. On the camera feed, they looked staggered. She used the remote PTZ camera to zoom in. The racks were vibrating at a frequency that made the camera lens flare. When she went down to manually reset the racks, she found that the floor was no longer solid. It had the consistency of a heavy, damp carpet. Every step she took left a footprint that didn't disappear. It stayed indented, like memory foam. She shone her light on the server chassis. The brand names, Dell, HP, IBM, had been replaced. Every single piece of hardware now bore the embossed logo of Passive Observation Holdings. But the logos weren't stamped into the metal. They were etched, thousands of times, in what looked like human handwriting. Sarah looked at the security monitor at the end of the hall. It showed her standing there. But in the video, she wasn't alone. A figure stood directly behind her, mimicking her every movement with terrifying synchronization. When she turned around, the hall was empty. She fled the building and never returned. The following morning, an inspection team was sent to Storage Wing D. They found the heavy security door locked from the inside. When they finally breached it, they found nothing. The room was gone. Behind the doorframe was only the original, undisturbed limestone of the Virginia crust. No servers, no wires, no floor. The architecture had simply retracted. The Elias case and the vanishing of the Virginia data wing remain officially unrecorded. There are no police reports, no insurance claims for the millions of dollars in lost hardware, and no lawsuits filed for unpaid wages. It is as if the events were surgically edited out of the timeline. When Elias attempted to track down the trust that hired him, he discovered that Passive Observation Holdings had been legally dissolved in the winter of 1992, 3 decades before he ever stepped foot in that hotel lobby. The address listed on his contract led to a fenced-off, vacant lot in downtown Cincinnati. According to neighbors, nothing has been built on that land since the original structure was demolished 40 years ago. But the most unsettling piece of evidence didn't come from the paperwork. It came from Elias's own voice recorder. Like many engineers working in isolation, Elias had kept a daily audio log to maintain his sanity and track his technical observations. He had the recorder in his pocket during the entirety of the Day 5 incident. When he finally felt safe enough to play the files back, he expected to hear his own voice describing the bunker's silence. Instead, the audio from the final 24 hours was a wall of white noise, interrupted by a rhythmic, mechanical scratching that matched the cadence of human speech. When run through a frequency analyzer, the scratching was revealed to be a series of coordinates. They don't point to a location on a map. They point to a specific depth, 600 meters below the surface of the Ohio River Valley. The recording doesn't end with the scratching. In the final 3 minutes, the audio clears. You can hear the sound of the emergency stairwell door opening. You can hear Elias's heavy breathing as he gasps for air. But behind his breathing, there is another sound. It is the sound of the bunker's ventilation hum, following him up the stairs. It didn't stop at the hatch. We like to think that the buildings we inhabit are dead things, arrangements of concrete, steel, and wood designed to serve our needs. But perhaps when we build them deep enough and isolate them from the rhythm of the sun, the architecture begins to develop a primitive consciousness, a consciousness that doesn't understand human life, only human patterns. It doesn't want to kill you. It wants to catalog you. It wants to see how the human soul reacts when the windows are gone, and the doors begin to multiply. I've uploaded the spectrogram of the Day 5 logs to our community tab. If you listen with high-quality headphones, you can hear a repeating pattern in the static, a sequence that sounds like a name, your name. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever entered a room and felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in the air pressure? Have you ever counted the doors in your workplace and come up with a different number on the way out? Have you ever looked at a ventilation grate and felt, for just a second, that it was breathing in sync with you? If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Silent Anomalies. We go deeper into the declassified archives next week. For now, pay attention to the layout of your own home. Ensure that the hallways are as long as they were this morning. Check the locks on your doors. And most importantly, if the hum of your electronics ever stops, hold your breath. I'm Silent Anomalies. Stay vigilant